Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. We'd like to thank you all for joining us. This is just a reminder that today's webinar will be recorded and we are going to get started. I'll be posting the webinar. David Ader. I'm the Program and Project Manager here at the Online Trust Alliance. Today our webinar is going to focus on a briefing of the 2014 Online Trust and Honor Roll Audit. Along with our Executive Director Craig Spiegel, we are very fortunate to have joining us Jeff Wilbur, who is the Vice President of Marketing at Iconics. Iconics, who has been a leader in consumer and brand protection via their various email solutions. We will be taking questions at the end, and please ask any questions in your question panel right to your side. And just so you know, you are muted, and we will be taking questions all at the end. Thank you, and I will now be handing it off to Craig Spiegel.
Great. Good morning, David, and thank you for introducing myself and Jeff. And I also before we get started, I want to really give the shout out to David, who's done a tremendous amount of work in the background here, working with our data providers, working with hundreds of companies as they've had questions on the honor roll and really drilling down. So all the work here that Jeff and I are presenting is through the hard work of David. So David, thank you again. But let's drill down into the honor roll and share what we're talking about, why we think it's important, and such here. So apologize for the slide here. Pause here for a second. But this is the 5th year in a row that we have undertaken this comprehensive analysis. We actually call it an audit now today, evaluating over 800 websites, over a few dozen data points within every company's site in major sectors. So we've looked at historically the top 100 banks, the top 500 e-commerce sites, the top 50 social sites. New to this year, we added the news and media segment, which you'll start to see a little further in our research, primarily because these sites are, more focused on being supported by advertising, and we wanted to take a look at how those sites are really handling data. And the second area in the news and media is these sites are increasingly moving to a registration or subscription basis. So how are those sites handling user logons and registration and consumer profiles? We've also looked at the top federal government sites and OTA members. When we look at the areas, we have 3 buckets of scoring: brand protection, security, and privacy. And in each category, a company can receive up to 100 base points. And what we'll review in a few moments, how you can also get bonus points for emerging best practices. And you can also lose points. For example, if you have a data loss incident or you have fines or settlements. And we'll go through each one of those. And an important key point is every year the bar changes and the bar raises. So yesterday's criteria, and you may have made the honor roll, if you stayed the same and did not innovate, no different than your business services, most likely you would not make the honor roll this year. So let's go a little further now. We understand the background of it, and really talk about where are we. So this year, if we look on the far right screen, 30% of all the 800 sites we evaluated made the honor roll. We saw that as a slight decline versus 2013 at 32%. And so what we looked at was the impact of the new segment, the news and media segment. And we actually found that while that was only 50 sites out of the 800, their performance was very low, and that brought down the overall ranking. So if you're looking at a year-to-year consistency, it was the same percentage, 32% as last year. But again, as I mentioned earlier, the bar has risen significantly, and we'll go through, and we have a lot more granularity in this year's analysis. So let's look at the past 3 years for each segment. So IR stands for Internet Retailer 100, and that's the top 100 retailers. And then the Internet Retail 500 is the top 500. So we see some slight drops of 3 points in the IR 100, 2 points in the IR 500. And really none of those are real material. And again, as I mentioned, since the bar has risen in so many areas, in many ways we're staying level ground. But what's interesting is we see the significant change of 8 points in the banks. And we'll go into the reasons for that. We're very pleased to see their progress, and some of that has been really as a result of what we believe is some of the shortcomings in the privacy sector that banks and financial institutions have historically held. We see a slight drop in the social 50, and some of that is attributed to, quite frankly, the different sites that come into play. So there's some trends there, and not surprisingly, OTA members. OTA members are somewhat biased here, primarily recognizing that these are companies that are by themselves, because they're involved with OTA, are leaders. So 88% is great. We would like to see that even higher. But the most concerning is the news segments. And this is the news and media sites. This is the news and media sites that quite often cover you as member companies or as attending large websites. And we see a very low proportion of those making the honor roll. And we'll drill into that. And this is that reason that we decided to make the comparison of year to year without them seeing the bias here. So first of all, as I mentioned, OTA members, and I want to say kudos to all of our members. And last week in Chicago, about 15 of our members participated with us at the Internet Retail Conference, and really, they are really important because not only do they make the honor roll, they are the companies that are powering many of the top 500 e-commerce and banking sites worldwide. And so again, it was great to see them participate. And hats off to all of them for their leadership and commitment to not only the best practices, but the collaboration. We also recognize the top 10. And so while we look at the honor roll, and again, the honor roll of the internet retailers, we also looked at those that had the absolute best score among the top 10. And they're listed here. And what's interesting is a lot of people say, well, the honor roll, it must be you need to have a huge investment in costs and resources. And, so it's no surprising companies like Walmart that would make it. Walmart is ranked number 4 worldwide for online revenues. But what's important to point out in this slide is BAM, or Books A Million, and they actually scored the top 10, but they're ranked number 480 or so. And so what that really underscores how the criteria are obtainable by companies of any size. So I think that's a key point to recognize. Another key point is, of course, these are some of them, Books A Million, Newegg, Big Fish, as well as ChristianBooks.com, who were there for the top 10 awards. We also recognize the top of class. And we're very proud that American Greetings, an OTA member, took the #1 position for the 2nd year in a row of all online retailers. So that's really significant. And it speaks to the work of the entire team, Gary, Joe, Mike Hammer, and such, their commitment. Another one is Twitter here, which you see on the screen, Bob Lord. And Twitter continues to push the limit, continually coming back and saying, how can we push forward other best practices? So again, 2nd year in a row that they actually achieved the #1 score of all segments evaluated. So congratulations to both of them. So let's look at the average scores to give you a little bit of an idea, and then we're going to jump into Jeff will be starting and going into some of the segments. So we look at the segments here, the average scores among all of the categories in the 3 categories here of domain and brand protection, server, and privacy. And as you see in the middle, server, we have a pretty good concentration. Those are the servers that have an SSL connection. So we only have a 5-point variability of 82 to 87%. What we do see, the domain protection, a fair amount of variability, almost a 2 to 1 between the news sites, again, having poor performance there. And also looking at the privacy sector, again, seeing the big drop of, again, the news segment there and their privacy policies and practices. So we look at all this, and I should remind everyone that all this data is available online on our site, all the methodology and such. And I do see a question that got asked about the methodology. And I do want to point out in November, we actually introduced a draft methodology with a public call for comment, and then at the end of January, February, we announced the methodology and then did webinars. So our goal is to be very transparent and very open, and our goal is to get as many companies to qualify for the honor roll. So we talk about the qualifying side. The opposite side of that is what is not making the honor roll. So if you look at sectors, so we have companies that made the honor roll. You have companies that had scores that were acceptable but were not top of class. And then you look at who failed and who received a failing grade in one or more of the categories. So again, you have 65% of the banks failed in one or more categories, as well as 62% of the news segments. So those are areas of concern, and again, where we have detailed information to explain why. And this actually helps you go back into each one of those major categories, why someone failed. And I should note here that you could fail in one or more categories, so the numbers may not add up. So a company could fail in all three, and so they'd be looked separately. So again, this gives us a tremendous amount of insight on what's being missed in each one of those areas here. It is interesting in the privacy area, about a third of the major categories failed in one area, and we actually went back thinking that may have been a mistake because it's rare you have that alignment there. So with that, I'm going to turn over the call now to Jeff Wilbur, who's actually going to share a little bit more of the in-depth analysis, starting with brand protection. Jeff?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, we're going to go through each of these major categories one by one and kind of talk about what the criteria were and then what we found as we did the analysis. So in the brand protection area, the primary thing that drives the base points, as you can see here, is email authentication. And we looked at supporting SPF and DKIM, the two main authentication methods, at the top level and subdomains for a company. So if you wanted to score maximum points, you would have both forms of authentication at the top level and subdomains. And then we also looked at DMARC, which is a way for a sender to tell a receiver what to do with failed authentication messages and to get feedback on their authentication. And this was introduced 2 years ago, and it's becoming more and more prominent, so we actually increased the weighting of it this year as opposed to previous years. The only penalty points we had in this broad category were associated with domain locking, and there was a penalty if you do not lock your domain. In fact, only a couple percent of companies across all the sectors don't lock their domains. That was a pretty strong score. So Craig, next slide. Yeah, so the area in looking at brand protection, these are the kind of questions we were asking that would relate to how you're protecting your brand or your site. Can it be spoofed? Can people spoof either your site or your email to fool a consumer into doing something that was dangerous or to allow your domain to be stolen? And so I talked about the fact that we looked at the different forms of email authentication. We did that. It's very easy to figure out whether a domain supports SPF. We have a tool on the OTA site where that can be done, as well as to look for DMARC records. And then we use some of our member companies to look for DKIM signing. And we even went to the point this year of subscribing to most of the newsletters or marketing emails for a lot of the Internet Retailer 500 and the banks and the social sites to look at the actual email headers so that we could verify the various forms of email authentication this year. So we kind of expanded our methodology to be more granular and more accurate in this year's report. Just a real quick overview. Most of you on the call probably already know this, but email authentication, the two main methods, they vary in how they do authentication. SPF uses a path. It kind of follows, does this server, is it authorized to send based on its IP address? Whereas DKIM, you put a signature on the message, and it doesn't matter what path it takes to get from one end to the other. Then the signing can be verified at the receiving end. They each have great benefits, and each have areas that they don't cover as well. So the best practice is actually to use both to have the best total authentication and protection to ensure that email messages are truly from the sender they purport to be. And so we factor that into our scoring this year. This is kind of a summary of the adoption across the different industry sectors. You can see that SPF and DKIM are fairly widely adopted in most of the sectors, SPF especially up in the 90s, and you can see that the low points for SPF are the federal 50 at 62% and the news sites at 72. So there's some work to be done there. DKIM's even a step lower across all the sectors. You see the federal 50 has very low support at 28%. And then the best practice that we increased the weighting on this year is to do both. And you can see that there's even more variability when you combine the two with the banking sites at 49%, the news sites at 50, and the federal 50 at 22, really needing some improvement there. So we're really pushing for that best practice to happen. And then DMARC was the other factor in the baseline scoring, and those are the bars on the right. And you can see that it's still in its early stages of adoption. OTA members are leading by far. Again, Craig pointed out that the membership is kind of leading in those areas and pushing it anyway. So you can see the other industry sectors have a long way to go. The social sites have adopted it the most quickly, but everyone else really needs to step up and adopt DMARC more quickly. So this slide is looking at whether the various sectors support SPF or DKIM, so one or the other. And you can see that the numbers look great in almost all the sectors. You had 100% for the Internet Retailer 100, a high 90s for most of the others. The news is lagging there, and you say, this is great. Everyone's supporting email authentication. But the fact is, when we look at how it's used, if you really want to protect your brand, you should be supporting SPF and DKIM at your top-level domains and at your subdomains. So a lot of companies get credit for supporting one or the other forms of email authentication through an outsourced third-party marketer, for instance, but they haven't yet adopted it in their core corporate domains. And if you really want to protect your brand, you want to do it at your top-level domain of your corporations, and then either use for email in addition to your marketing domains. So supporting both is a best practice, as noted on this table. And this looks at the progress over the years. And you can see that the Internet retailers have actually made the strongest headway, other than OTA members, of supporting both forms of authentication on their sites. And so you can see they jumped this last year 12 to 18 points, depending on whether you're looking at the Internet Retailer 100 or 500. The bank stayed flat in support of both. The Federal 50 was about flat. Social 50 was about flat. And then OTA jumped up again. And then, of course, the News 50 still have a ways to go. So there is a lot of room for improvement here, even though that previous slide, that most sites support a form of email authentication, it's not enough to just support it in one small area. It needs to be supported across all the email use for a company or an organization. So this is looking at DMARC adoption across the years, so we can track the growth. And you can see that in terms of numbers starting near zero in the first year of 2012, there's been good growth, doubling or tripling or more, but then the absolute numbers are still quite low. 15% for the Internet Retailer 100, 6 for the 500, and so on down the line. So there's a lot of room for improvement here. DMARC is a very easy thing to support. It helps receivers make good decisions about whether emails are, what to do with them if authentication fails. So we're really encouraging people to support it as quickly as they can. And you can see that OTA members and the Social 50 are the leaders in this area. So the next broad category is infrastructure security. And here we have a variety of criteria that feed into this category. So the base points of 100 that Craig talked about initially were primarily based on server and SSL implementation, and we'll look at an example of how we did that and the tools we used to do it. You could receive bonus points if you supported extended validation certificates. Those are the ones that give you a green bar in your browser so you know you're on the right site. Always on SSL, so that from the start of a session. It's encrypted. And then DNSSEC, which is an extra layer of security on your DNS. You could receive penalty points if we did scanning of the sites, and if we found cross-site scripting or vulnerabilities there, or malware or malicious links on the site, you were actually given penalty points. So that's kind of how we structured the criteria and methodology in this area. So here we see the main categories that we looked at. The summary score for the SSL and site security, and that's out of 100 points. The middle set of bars there is the adoption of extended validation certificates, and the rightmost there is AOSSL. So just make a quick comment on each one of those across industry segments. The summary scores were actually quite good. Craig pointed that out in a slide earlier. We didn't have the federal 50 on that previous slide, which is the low liar here. And there's definitely room for improvement on their site security. They did not qualify for the honor roll, and that's why they weren't on the previous slide, because we don't have privacy scores for them, so we can't put them in the broad context. For extended validation certificates, you can see that the leaders in that area of adoption are the banks. So when you go to a bank and you see a green browser bar, you know you're on that site, and that's primarily due to the fact that they've been targeted by so many people with fake sites. This can ensure a user that they're on the right site. Most of the other sectors are in the 1/3 or so adoption. So there's room for improvement there, but that's fairly strong. The federal sites and the news sites are the ones that are lagging in the adoption of those certificates. And then Always On SSL is a practice that more and more companies are adopting, and we'll talk about it in a slide a little later, but you can see again that the banks, because of the financial transactions that they do, are by far the highest adopters, more than 3 to 1, so that once you hit their site, everything that's transmitted is encrypted so that somebody can't break in on a wireless hotspot or anything else to kind of grab passwords or user logins. And none of the other sectors really have very strong adoption of that yet.
Hey, Jeff, one point to point out on this slide here is, a lot of the government sites, they have low scores, and primarily is, while they're not taking credit cards, they are asking for consumers to register on sites, maybe for forms and other areas. And as the privacy landscape has changed and the concerns about data security, it is concerning to see those federal sites having such poor, in comparison to other segments, implementation of site security. And the news segment is very concerning because, again, more and more news sites are asking for consumer profile information, demographic information, that even just a simple username and password is now considered PII in California and other areas. So those are some concerns that we see, and it really just reinforces companies' need to rethinking what data they're collecting and how they're securing it.
Yeah, exactly. And we should point out that on the federal sites, those aren't just the top 50 size sites or whatever. They're the top 50 consumer-facing sites. So we were looking at sites where consumers would be interacting, and these things would come into play, as Craig mentioned. Right, so here's an example of the primary tool we used for the baseline 100-point scoring was SSL Labs tool, and this is a screenshot of Twitter from yesterday, it looks like. And they give a letter score, which we then map to a number, and it looks across all areas of server implementation and SSL, the certificates, the protocols, the ciphers, and so forth that are used. And we'll get, in a slide or two, we'll go into a little more detail on this. But the common issues, and they rank you from an A+, is the highest you can get, to an F. And based on what they see, scores their letter grades can be capped at an A- or a B, or you get an F automatically if certain things are detected. So common issues that cause low scores across various sites are support of TLS 2.0. It's an automatic F because it's considered insecure. The beast attack, I think, caps you at a B if you're susceptible to that. We saw sites with mismatched certificates, and then the next two, cross-site scripting and iframes exploits, we actually used high-tech bridge tool to scan for vulnerabilities there, and that was penalty points, as I described a few slides ago. And then the other thing that changed this year is that 1024-bit keys are now considered an F due to the NIST requirement that in 2014 everyone has to use a minimum of 2048-bit keys. And so where last year 2048-bit was a bonus points because it wasn't a baseline requirement yet, now it's considered part of the baseline. So that's just one example of how the bar keeps moving up as new things are detected, vulnerabilities are become known or exploited especially. You have to continually monitor your site to make sure you're using the latest and best protocols and keys and so forth. So here's some other examples. The criteria was given a little more granularity with plus and minus grades. So an A plus was 100 points. We mapped an A minus to 90. That gave finer granularity of scoring at that level. If you wanted an A, you had to use TLS 1.2. Otherwise, you're capped at a B, and so on down the line. You can see the various examples here. And this is the SSL Labs, or Qualys SSL Labs tool. And then another factor that they do is the bottom set of bullets here, where even if you had a strong configuration that warranted an A, there are various kind of minor issues that could create warnings where they would cap you at an A minus. So this is a great tool for looking at the balance of all the various things that go into SSL configuration and site security and keeping pace with the latest practices and the latest vulnerabilities that are detected out there so that you know that you're on top of things. If we look at how that's improved or not across the years, we can see that most of the segments actually dipped slightly this year, a point or two or 3 or 4 at most. But again, they're clustered with the exception of the federal 50 up in the mid to high 80s. So reasonably strong, but there were definitely areas of failure that happened at individual organizations. But of the 3 categories that we studied, this one is actually the strongest. It caused the least amount of failures, and it had the highest overall average scores. So a point about always-on SSL, I already described it a little bit. It means that your session is encrypted from the start, and it's becoming a very strong best practice. The initial sites that adopted it were mainly the social networks, but even in this last year, Bing and Google both have adopted always-on SSL so that your session is encrypted entirely, which prevents someone from sitting on a Wi-Fi hotspot and seeing your information in the clear. And there's a link here to some more resources about this on the OTA site.
Yeah, Jeff, I might also interject here, is that banking sites have also been quickly adopting, again, recognizing the risk of usernames and passwords that could be scraped, whether through software or through, Wi-Fi hotspots there. So we're seeing more of that, and clearly commerce sites are moving down the path. And so there's lots of resources that we have on the site there, and that's certainly something that we should be thinking about, every company should be thinking about.
Yeah, exactly. As we saw in the chart before, the banks have adopted it almost 80% of the top 100, but the other segments are lagging quite significantly in that area. So this is something that they can definitely move to address and further protect their consumers.
Well, great. I'm going to take the helm here for a second here, and we're going to kind of talk about the third pillar, privacy. And again, the whole belief is that you need to be thinking about the data you collect, how do you secure it, and then how are you using it. And in the eyes of a consumer, all of this overlaps into what we consider, a key part of the trust score. So part of our base point analysis actually involves auditing, and manually reading each website's privacy policy and scoring that privacy policy. So the policy alone can get you 50 points. In addition, we also look at what's actually occurring, where are the third-party calls being made, what third parties are collecting data, and what are their respective privacy policies. Are they also part of any self-regulatory oversight? So that's how we get a core baseline points for any site that's in place today. We also have several bonus points. Some of this is new this year. For example, we've moved to the best practice of having a layered privacy policy. And it's a layered short form, effectively, where in consumer speak, a site or a web app would actually say and disclose what data is being used, how it's being used, and why. And then you would click through that to get the legalese or long form. Today, that's a bonus point. Most likely that will move to a core part of our points for next year. Do sites have bilingual privacy policies? As we look at, English may not be the dominant language by some site visitors or their language spoken at home. As a best practice, we think sites should have bilingual policies up there. So again, we have that, and I should say in both these cases, OTAs implemented these things. State of California in January stipulated that under disclosure requirements, sites must state whether they honor or don't honor the do not track status that has been set in their browser. We think that's very important. Again, sites get bonus points on that. We realize for some people that's controversial. Do not track has not made its way out of the W3C working group yet, but it is again following compliance. And again, originally this was going to be part of the base points, but because of the timing, many sites and companies still weren't aware of that. We've now, this year, it's a bonus point. And it's important to note, this is required if you have a consumer that resides in the state of California. And so our recommendation is all sites have this in there because you really don't know where a consumer resides. And another area that's new for this year was the use of tag management or privacy solutions as a bonus point. And as we look we'll drill down the data as it's becoming very, very complex on the number of third parties. How do sites better manage those third parties and the sharing and usage of data? And so we believe in the use of a tag management system is a best practice there. So we actually track that. And consistent with what Jeff outlined earlier, there's also bonus points. Is the who owns the site, where it's located, is it public or private? We believe a site should be public. Has a site had a data breach incident in the past 24 months? And has a site had an FTC, state settlement, or EU action in the past 24 months? So any of those bonus points could impact a site, but again, it does not prevent a site from making the honor roll. So key points to consider there. So let's look at the major categories here. What was the average privacy score? Again, not surprising, OTA members. But again, many of our members, half our members are not consumer facing, so they're real business to business. So they didn't have some of the challenges. But I think, again, the highlight is the social sites that have really the more clear and concise privacy policies. That may be also because they're also sharing and collecting more data. Lots of reasons you can look at that. The one area that was a surprise to us all was the implementation of layered notices, and the banks clearly took the lead in there. And so partially through, I think, some criticism in the past years, but the financial services are really showing some great progress and leadership in this area. And certainly there's no reason any site can't do that. I encourage you to visit our site or others such as Trustee and others out there that have good examples. Perhaps one of the best ones out there I can see is Publishers Clearinghouse, who went from a 4,000 word policy down to under 400. It still links to legalese, but it provides consumers in less than 400 words really clear, concise transparency of what data they collect, how they use it, and who they share it with, and how long do they retain it for. So moving to do not track disclosure, again, this is, are these sites compliant with the state of California? And so on this slide here is, again, only 22% of retailers are compliant, 22% of the news sites as well. That's very concerning. And if your company has any customers in California, you should very seriously look at how do you comply with this requirement. The last area was new also this year was the using of a tag management system or a privacy solution. This surprised us at first, seeing the news segment that has poor scores in other areas are doing so well in this area, and that's as bonus points. But we then really looked at that and why, and the reason is very clear, is those news and media sites, whether it's CNN or Wall Street Journal or New York Times, are heavily dependent on advertising and heavily dependent on working with multiple ad networks and ad exchanges. And hence, there's a tremendous amount of ad tags that they're trying to manage. So again, when we understand that, it's no surprise here. Conversely, social sites, but many of the social sites themselves are more platforms themselves, so they aren't dealing with as many third-party calls. Facebook would be a good example of that as well. So as I mentioned, the do not track is required as of January 1. We have information on here, and also sites get bonus points if they actually say that they honor the setting and don't collect data. So, and as we see it, again, this is OTA's position from a self-regulation perspective. We believe the data, even if you have it set, a site can still use it for first-party usage. And other permitted uses, assuming that the data was all anonymous, was for analytics, measurement purposes, frequency capping, and related analytics. So we do see that there are legitimate reasons that you would still use the data, and your privacy policy could specify this. And clearly, do not track should not interfere with any fraud detection and security purposes. And as we see more and more challenges out there today, we think that's very important that sites support that, and we also think it's very important that the use of do not track does not preempt these other categories. Layer notice, I mentioned the example from Publishers Clearinghouse. Again, it provides clarity, readability, transparency, and it's something that all sites should consider. And I should also say that one of our other members, DigiCerts, produced for a second year in a row a very comprehensive infographic, and I encourage everyone to check it out. On the site there, we have a tremendous amount of resources, and this kind of sums it up, and actually combining not only the honor roll challenges, but some of the areas of data breach and site security. So I encourage you to look at that. You can download that as a large format image as well. So what's next? And we'll take some time for Q&A, and David, I'm sure, has got a few questions queued up for us. We are going to be releasing by the end of August a state of state on email authentication, taking the data we shared here and going into much deeper analysis on the subdomain issue, park domain issues, and such. We're also going to be exploring more in the mobile landscape, and we'll have more data on the best practices on mobile. And we also plan on adding another category to our 2014 honor roll, and that would be analyzing the top 100 sites in Australia and the top 50 sites in New Zealand and taking another view and see are there some trends and differences for all of those. Obviously, we want to focus on similar segments, but again, to see what are the best practices and recognizing these issues are global issues. So we do have the resources here I encourage you to go to. All the charts we have are on the website, as well as all the data and references here. So David, I want to pass it back to you and see are there some questions that you feel that have been raised or ones that we should explore a little further. We have a few minutes for that, and also encourage attendees to submit their questions on the dashboard.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you very much, Jeff. We really appreciate it. Very informative, guys. We actually have several questions already lined up. The first one I will actually go to Jeff. This is about email authentication. It says, we have DKIM in our marketing email from a third party. Do we need to provide it on our corporate mail as well if it's only for internal use?
Yes, there are, well, I didn't quite catch the end of that question. Let me make sure. Do we have to provide it on our corporate domain as well?
Do we need to use it on our corporate domain if it's purely used for internal use? It also says why.
Okay. So DKIM should be used on any domain where you're sending email outside the company and it's going to traverse the internet. There are companies that the way they structure things for email is maybe the top-level domain, company.com, isn't actually used to send email. For SPF, you can actually put a record there that states we don't send email from here, so a receiver can know that if someone pretends to be your company, they know that email doesn't come from that source. DKIM doesn't have an equivalent saying, but any email that does get out of your company should be DKIM signed from whatever those domains are, whether it's a top-level domain in the company, which is pretty typical, or maybe a subdomain that's created for sending outside. And the why is, in general, that receivers can use this information to authenticate email messages these two different ways. And I described earlier on that they each have their own method, and they each have kind of a hole in their ability as well. Like SPF doesn't work well with forwarding lists and things like that, and DKIM has susceptibility in other areas, but using them both combined, they cover each other's weaknesses and allow a receiver to make the best decision on whether an email is truly authentic and then deliver it on to the recipient.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And then I'll move to one that's directed to Craig. If we keep or share data for legal reasons, do we lose privacy points? How do we know what type of data we are and are not allowed to keep?
I'm sorry, David, it wasn't really clear there.
If we keep or share data, I think they mean with third parties or retain data for legal reasons.
Okay, great.
Do we lose privacy?
So again, actually, that's a key point. At times, companies, due to legal proceedings, are forced to turn over their data as part of a legal proceeding. We actually have recommended copy to include in your privacy policy, basically stating that if you are forced to share data as a result of legal action, that you would make attempts to notify that consumer that their data has been shared. And I say attempts because there's no absolute definition of that. So that's clearly one easy area for someone to share. And again, especially in the days now of the NSA requirements, there are more and more companies are adding that in there. While it's obvious that they may have to disclose that. So key point to understand, and a great question.
All right. This question could be answered by either of you. It says, is our certificate provider supposed to inform us if our certificate is out of compliance?
Well, this is Craig. I can kind of, I think there's two sides of this. So a certificate isn't really out of compliance. A certificate is one part of your SSL security. So if a certificate is invalid, so I guess the one use case would be a 1024 certificate. And for the past 2 years, all the CAs have been upgrading their clients, their customers to upgrade their certificates. And typically certificates have a 1 or 2 year life. So this is sort of natural evolution of that. So there are some stragglers out there, but again, in that case, it's not an issue of a certificate being insecure. It's really about an outdated or legacy certificate that needs to be replaced.
All right, we have one more. How do you find malicious links on your site if you are unaware that where they are?
So again, you're talking about if there is malicious code on a site? is the question. It's hard to understand the questions sometimes that are being asked here. But there are tools that you can use and should be using to continually manage your site. And so we use a combination of them, and we don't want to certainly endorse any one company. They're listed in the methodology, but there are basically services to continually monitor your site. And it's really important. We found a few cases this year where malicious content was on the site, and what was the result was that they weren't aware that they had copied and pasted some content, and so what was happening is the malicious links. You know, there's another question that got asked that I want to kind of tag on real quick here was, you know, how do you test the SSL of a site, and especially if there's a subdomain that's actually being used for SSL? And that's a great question that's asked. And so what we do is we actually analyze that. So we first start out with, let's just say hypothetically mysite.com or foo.com, and our tool actually crawls and finds out if there is a subdomain or other domain related to that. Now, if that isn't available, someone needs to go on mute because it's picking up. I think we have a bad echo here. So the first thing is there a subdomain? Thank you. The second thing is that if we don't see that, we then actually manually visit the site directly ourselves, and we see if there's a login. So the tool doesn't 100% find it because sometimes it may not be a subdomain, it may be a sister domain, and so that's how we manually override that. So that's one area there.
Thank you. I think we have two more questions. One is, why does the Fed 50 not have a privacy score?
So great question. That's been asked before. Reality is, as we've analyzed the sites, we've been really focused on more consumer-focused sites. It's something that we could be doing, we just haven't done in the past. Primarily, it's one that is partially based on resources and partially because the federal governments aren't like marketers sharing data. So when we looked at it before, we found that it was all pretty much the same, and we almost found that it wasn't necessarily relevant to what was occurring on them. It is something we're going to look at. Do we add it back in? So it's not one that's one that we think is material, and so effectively you could come up with a blended trust score for them without including that. And the bigger concern that we have right now is what are the federal sites doing to stop the rise of the forged and malicious email, and as Jeff mentioned, the low adoption of SPF and DKIM combined, and then also the concern of how they really have inadequate SSL security infrastructure in place on the sites that are collecting data today. So those are the big areas, and I should note that we have reached out to both Homeland Security and the White House and provided a pre-briefing based on the severity of these issues.
Thank you very much, and we have only one last question as of now, so if you have anything to ask, please get it in quickly. So our last question for now is, if you have a tag management system, to meet the requirement, you have to have all the tags on your site loaded by that system.
I guess I'll take that one too here. The answer is no. We are looking at this point this year, was there a presence of a tag management system? And basically we're able to do that by scanning those sites based on an index of about a dozen tag management solutions out there. So again, only thing that we're looking at today is the presence of such a solution. It doesn't even mean that a company is even using it or how they're using it, but it is a best practice, and we certainly encourage it to help provide that visibility into the practices. And these are all examples of David, that I'm glad that we're getting these questions of the evolution of this. You know, someone actually asked, I saw a question, shouldn't that be mandatory? And so we constantly are reevaluating this, and we certainly welcome participants on this call to give us feedback. What should we be changing going forward? What should the criteria be for next year?
Thank you. We actually did get one last question in the meantime. This one was directed towards Jeff, just asking if there was an evolution of sort of companies that made the honor roll. How many made it this year? How many made it last year? Do companies tend to make it multiple years in a row? And why companies tend to not make the honor roll when they made it in the past?
Yeah, I can start with that one, and maybe Craig can add on. We do, and if you get the report on the site, we actually in the appendix call out all the companies or organizations that make the honor roll this year, and then we have a star or 2 stars next to them if they made it last year and the year before. So across all the sites, if I remember the numbers right, there were about 88 that have made it now 3 years in a row. So that would be 88 out of the roughly 240 that or 250 that made it this year. So roughly a third that made it this year have done it for 3 years in a row. I think the number was 77 made it 2 years in a row. So there is some definite consistency up near the top there of companies making it year after year. If the other part of the question was why might you make it one year and then not another, and that's primarily due to, as we've talked about, across all the categories, the bar is being raised in various ways. On the email side, it's that we put more emphasis on supporting both SPF and DKIM and having DMARC records. So where a company might have made it a few years ago, we've changed the weighting of the criteria, and now they might be just under. Or in the SSL area, we laid out a number of different things that the Qualys SSL Labs tool has, risen the bar on use of protocols or, the number of bits in a key or, various things that can affect your score by 10 points or so, and that might knock you out of honor roll qualification. And then the privacy area, those have become a little more rigid as well, but we've put in opportunity for bonus points. So most of people that drop out it's not due to the fact that they were doing something and it just went away. It's the fact that they haven't kept pace with the evolving nature of the requirements in these various areas.
Yeah, Jeff, I think that was spot on. Just to give you an idea, though, as you look at all the sites surveyed, roughly 12% made the honor roll 3 years in a row. And clearly, and the report actually in the last few pages actually has those in bold and in stars, I should say, next to them. And 22% 2 years in a row. So obviously, we're very excited to see that. We'd like to see the numbers grow. And again, we're committed as a nonprofit to help companies in these areas. And the resources are available on our site to download. And if you have feedback, we want to hear from you. These are not being done in a vacuum. These criteria have been done on a multi-stakeholder effort, meeting with hundreds of companies as well as government agencies, those in the U.S. and such, and internationally. So I just want to thank everyone for their contribution, because this is really a work product that represents dozens of companies providing data and hundreds of stakeholders giving us input. So David, back to you.
Well, we'd like to thank you very much, Jeff, for joining us, and thank you, Craig, for hosting this webinar. The webinar will be posted shortly on our site to download for video or the PDF deck slides. You can also download the honor roll at otalines.org/honor roll as seen on the page. And if you'd like to email us any questions, email us at the address you see below, craigs@otalliance.org. Thank you very much for joining us.